Hello, and welcome to the third part of my series discussing American imperialism. Today we are going to discuss the effects of the Spanish American War and the annexation of Cuba and a few other places from this Spanish concessions, as well as our policies concerning China, before we move on in the next video to the presidency of TR and how Teddy Roosevelt influenced American imperialism with his ideals. So without further ado, let us begin. So a lot of Americans, after finding out that the United States received all these concessions from Spain, were a bit worried about what this war might mean for the country. And so here we see kind of the rise of anti-imperialists. And these are people who kind of question what it means for America to become an empire. They kind of say that becoming an empire means that you're lording over people in faraway places. And some of these people are afraid that seizing these lands in the Pacific might lead to war with Japan in the future. Additionally, and this is where we see a little bit of racism come into the mix, some of them believe that Asian people of Asian descent cannot ever be part of a democracy for some reason inherent in their ethnic genealogy. They just can't. Democracy doesn't make sense to them, which doesn't make any sense at all. But anyway, additionally, on a more moral ground, they also thought that people were questioning how the United States could uphold the beliefs written in the Declaration of Independence if we became an empire. So that idea of everybody being entitled to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness kind of thing. Well, you know, how can you have that if you have somebody, if you're ruling over, if you're being ruled by another country? Wasn't that the whole point of writing that, was that we wouldn't have to be ruled by a country, and then saying that nobody else should be ruled by another country? But no, apparently they're saying no. These imperialist people are saying, oh no, that's fine. We can rule other people. They're like, have you forgotten the Declaration of Independence? And a lot of famous people actually wound up becoming affiliated with this cause, such as Samuel Gompers, Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, and William Jennings Bryan. Now, there were a lot of more other people as well involved, but I only kind of limited my list here to people we've talked about in the scope of this class that you've heard of. So you'd be like, oh, these people, or people who are just that famous. Particularly, many people were disturbed at the idea of the United States ruling the Philippines. The majority of the Filipinos did not want to be ruled by the United States any more than the Spanish. They kind of saw it as replacing one flag with the other. So now, instead of being ruled by the Spanish, well, you're being ruled by the Americans, and not much has changed. I even heard that they left several Spanish officials in place and just changed their affiliation to make things easier. Additionally, this resulted in guerrilla warfare breaking out that was being led by a man named Emilio Aguinaldo, and the government did not really take kindly to this man and his movement, so they decided to attack his forces with brutal methods, and a lot of these methods wound up reaching the news of these reached back to the U.S., and many were shocked and appalled by the fact that we were using methods not terribly dissimilar from Weyler's methods when he was ruling over Cuba. They're like, wait a second, we just defeated a guy who was doing this, and now we're going to start doing it? No, we shouldn't do that. So that kind of caused a lot of unrest. However, we do still continue to hold on to the Philippines until after World War II. We eventually give them independence on July 4th of all days. So, maybe a little bit of similarity there. But anyway, moving on to Cuba, back to Cuba, Cuba had been a little bit damaged by the war, so we decided to reorganize and try to make, despite kind of outwardly conquering territories, we wanted to say, no, we're not taking over Cuba, we're just trying to free them from the Spanish, because that probably looked better on paper. So in a lot of these amendments that I'm speaking of in the next few minutes are amendments that were added to this new Cuban constitution. So that's really what it's, and also some legislation of the trade agreements between, or the agreements between the new Cuban state and the United States. So when it's ever you hear something amendment, it's an amendment relating to the Cuban Constitution, not like the American Constitution. So the first of these we're going to talk about is the Teller Amendment, which was in 1898. And what it was it basically pledged that the United States would not exercise sovereignty over Cuba. So what they're saying is that The United States is not taking over Cuba, and Cuba is not an American territory. Cuba is an independent country. Despite this, American troops still stayed in Cuba. So, that's kind of, maybe take that one with a grain of salt, considering what else is going to be discussed in the next bits of legislation. A lot of time was spent during this rebuilding to building up the island's infrastructure to make them a better country and a more modern country. So they were, restoring what was destroyed in the war, rebuilding buildings. Additionally, they started organizing a school system and a financial system, so banks and banking. They also created a new constitution for a Cuban state. So as I said, these amendments are being put into the Cuban constitution. Additionally, and I think this is quite good, a commission was headed by Major Walter Reed of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, and he began procedures to minimize the prevalence of yellow fever in Cuba. And this is, I think, very significant because yellow fever transmitted by mosquitoes impedes a lot of work, and it kind of gets everybody sick, so you don't want that to happen. So he's trying to, in his general health idea. And I think Walter Reed, I believe, is a very famous gentleman who wound up having a hospital named after him in New York City. I think Walter Reed Hospital, I've heard that name on the news a few times. Additionally, another amendment would be the Platt Amendment in 1903, and this one was very, very obvious. Obviously, a bit of American meddling. So Cuba is not allowed to make treaties with foreign powers that would limit its independence. So they can't make a treaty with a foreign country if it would limit their independence. Similarly, no foreign powers are allowed to purchase Cuban territory, except for the United States, of course. Cuba can also sell or lease land to the United States for coaling and naval stations. So they're saying, you can't lend land to anybody else except us, just because that's what we say. Additionally, Cuba is not allowed to contract debt that it can't repay, so they can't wind up being greatly in debt to American or to other countries. Additionally, the United States was allowed to step in whenever necessary, quote, for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. So basically, if it's deemed necessary, the United States can step in to defend Cuba with its military from whatever there might be, whatever danger there might be, whether it be real or made up. Additionally, the larger effect of these stipulations meant that they were demanded that these both had to be included in the Cuban Constitution and any agreements that were made with the U.S. before American troops could be removed from Cuba. So the Cubans had to accept these amendments before they could be allowed. They would be left alone, so to speak. And the Platt Amendment wound up being tied into a permanent agreement, despite a lot of Cuban protest in 1903. So we see a lot of the United States kind of is saying, yeah, Cuba's independent, but not really from us. So there's colonization, but not really. It's more like if you ever played Hearts of Iron, they kind of puppeted Cuba, you could say, instead of annexing it, if that makes any sense. Additionally, we're going to take a move over. We talked about colonization in regions of the world. Now we're going to talk about colonization competition, you could say, with the Europeans, because we're going to talk about China. So China... we're going to talk about something called the Open Door. So with China, after the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895, China was left weakened severely militarily because they got their butts kicked by the Japanese. And because the Japanese, as I said in our Zoom meeting, they had not sat idly by. They had very quickly upgraded their technology by the 1900s and wound up being able to stand toe-to-toe with any European power and have parity, whereas the Chinese still were dealing with that the Europeans as it was, and so they were unable to upgrade the way the Japanese did. So China was eventually carved up by the European powers into various spheres of influence. They gobbled up railroad rights, mining rights, and even declared an immunity from or abolishing imperial Chinese rule in these spheres of influence. The U.S. kind of arrived late to the Chinese colonization party, which led Secretary of State John Hay to institute the open door policy. I suspect that if we had not arrived late and we had been able to stake a claim of our own sphere of influence, I suspect that John Hay might never have been led to institute the open door policy, because as you're going to see when I explain it, the open door policy is very much a way of saying, hey, we need to trade too. So it's a way of getting Americans into these trading ports that are owned by these other European nations. I suspect if we had our own sphere of influence somewhere, anywhere, wherever it might be, we might not have instituted this policy at all because we wouldn't have deemed it necessary because, we've got our own little area. But we don't have our own little area because we arrived late to the party. So we wound up having to institute this. So what was the open door policy? Well, I'll tell you. John Hay, Secretary of State, wrote individually to the leaders of England, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia. And what he essentially said was he outlined a number of things to them, explaining what his plan was. He said these countries are not to interfere with the rights of the 22 merchant ports in China. So that whole limiting or abolishing the Chinese imperial influence, that's wrong. You guys have to let them do their thing. Additionally, they cannot disturb Chinese collection of trade duties. So any tariffs, taxes, or stuff on goods that you're bringing in that the Chinese want to implant, you have to let them do that. That's how it goes. Additionally, they could not increase the rates of railroads or harbor dues, which the idea being that if you did that, it would kind of make it more difficult for other countries to trade, so giving beneficial preferential pricing to your own nation's merchants versus other nations' merchants, namely the United States. And so they would be closing their spheres of influence to trades from other people, but we're saying, no, you got to leave it open. Hence the open door. Additionally, each nation in the world should have equal commercial treatment throughout China. And he's saying each nation in the world. So if somebody from like Bangladesh wants to sail to China and trade, you can. But in reality, he's saying people from the Americas need to come over, and which really means us, but he's talking in broad terms. So that way it looks less selfish. Additionally, what's kind of funny is when he outlines all of these, the kind of great powers of the world, England, France, Russia, Germany, Japan, kind of were like, didn't really answer directly. They're kind of like, maybe, I don't know. Maybe we'll think about it. Sure, I don't know. We'll get back to you on that one. So they didn't really give a direct answer. And we're going to kind of look more at the open door. That's kind of a sticking point that's going to become an issue with presidents much later, until after World War II even. So, like, we're going to see Teddy Roosevelt talk a lot about the open door. His successors, Wilson's trying to push the open door, getting all the way up to even Franklin Delano Roosevelt is talking about the open door, saying we need to keep the open door in China. We need to keep the open door in China so we can keep trading with China, and the other European powers are kind of like, nah, not really. And they're like, no, we got to keep the open door. And the European powers are like, nah, I don't know. Because part of it is they're afraid. They don't want to, they don't want to open up their ports to trade, but at the same time, they don't want to really go to war with the United States. Because they saw what they did to Spain. They're like, oh gosh, watch out. So after the Spanish-American War, that kind of was, the significance of that was that the Americans had, kind of demonstrated on the world stage saying, hey, we're here, we're big, we're scary, don't mess with us. Look what happened to Spain. You want that to happen to you? And again, you don't want, and additionally, the fear is that if one of these powers were to go and declare war on the United States by themselves, then maybe, seeing weakness, another country, say England decides, or Germany decides to declare war on the United States, well then France or England might declare war on Germany to say, hey, because while they're busy fighting the Americans out in the Pacific and China, they'll go in and like attack the Germans at home or in the other ocean and have another naval war in the Atlantic as well. So that idea of, these guys are all trying to make sure they don't get stabbed in the back while they're trying to fight the United States, that's why they don't really give a solid answer and attempt to antagonize the United States. But at the same time, they're not really openly saying, yes, come trade with us. They're kind of sitting on the fence as to whether or not they want to let the United States in, because they don't want the United States, they don't want to give up their trade, but at the same time, they don't want to risk war with not just the United States, but other European powers. And that's really all I have to say for today. Thank you for attending. Tomorrow we will be, or not tomorrow, but next time we will be talking about the different Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and his philosophy with American imperialism kind of going on from him into Taft and Wilson. So that will be the next video. And until then, I will see you guys next time.